The silence was the worst part. It was a hollow, gaping thing that had settled over the 100 acres of Stone family land. The moment the low rumble of the John Deere's diesel engine had vanished down the county road, Jedediah Stone stood on his porch, the worn wood groaning under his boots, and listened to that silence. It was the sound of theft, not just of property, but of history, of memory. The tractor wasn't just a tractor. It was a 1978 4440, the last machine his father had bought new. Jed had learned to drive on its wide green fender, his father's steady hand on his shoulder. He'd used it to pull his own son, Caleb, on a hay wagon for his 5th birthday party, years before the sickness took the boy. He'd used it to dig the very grave his wife Martha now rested in, over by the stand of ancient oaks that marked the edge of their property. The machine's faded paint and oil-stained engine block held more of his life than the farmhouse did, and now it was gone. He'd seen the flatbed truck pull away, brazen as you please in the midday sun. He'd been in the back pasture, mending a fence line the new neighbor's prize-winning hounds had torn through for the 3rd time that week. By the time he'd sprinted back to the barn, all that was left was a set of muddy Dweltier tracks. On his gravel drive in that deafening, soul-crushing silence, he called Sheriff Brody. Of course, Brody was a good man, but a tired one, overseeing a county where resources were stretched thinner than a worn-out fan belt. "I hear you, Jed. I do." Brody's voice crackled over the phone. "A big green tractor. Can't be too hard to spot. But you got any proof who took it? Any cameras?" Jedediah looked around the farm. His cameras were the crows in the oak trees, and the hawk that circled overhead. "Proof. Sheriff, the Hamiltons have been trying to buy me out for a year. They told me last week, and I quote, they'd do what was necessary to get this eyesore of a farm cleared out for their panoramic view. That's circumstantial, Jed. Richard Hamilton is a big-shot lawyer from the city. He'll tie me in knots if I go onto his property without a warrant, and a judge won't give me one based on a hunch. It ain't a hunch, Bill. It's them." Jed's voice cracked, the rage and grief a physical thing in his throat. "I'll put the word out." Brody sighed, the weariness in his voice a final judgment. "Keep an eye out. Let me know if you see anything. Don't do anything rash, Jed. Don't do anything rash." The words echoed in the quiet kitchen after he hung up. He looked at his hands. They were his father's hands, calloused and scarred, maps of a life spent working the earth. They knew how to fix an engine, birth a calf, and mend a fence. They were not the hands of a man who waited patiently for a system that had already failed him. The Hamiltons hadn't just taken a tractor, they had taken his father's legacy, his son's memory, his wife's final ride. They had ripped the heart out of his history and left it to bleed out in the silence. Rashness wasn't the plan. The plan was methodical. It was agricultural. It was iron in earth. For the next 48 hours, Jedediah Stone became a ghost on his own land. He didn't eat, he barely slept. He moved between his workshop and the private, rutted access road that cut through a dense patch of woods on the northern edge of his property, a road the Hamiltons had started using as their own personal shortcut to the main highway, their gleaming black SUV, a daily trespass, a constant, arrogant reminder of their encroachment. His workshop was a cathedral of forgotten steel. Old plows, cultivators, and subsoilers his father had deemed obsolete, but couldn't bear to scrap. They were relics of a bygone era, heavy over-engineered and forged from American steel that laughed at the flimsy alloys of modern machinery. Jed's hands moved with a grim purpose, his mind a cold, clear engine of physics and vengeance. He started with the main tine of an old Vieira subsoiler. It was a 3-foot-long, 2-inch-thick shard of hardened steel, designed to shatter compacted earth a yard deep. Using an acetylene torch, he cut it free from its rusted frame. The hiss of the torch filled the workshop, the blue-white flame a stark contrast to the encroaching darkness. He spent hours with a grinding wheel, shaping the tip into a brutal, armor-piercing point. The shriek of metal on stone was the only sound that could drown out the silence. It was the sound of his rage being given a voice, a shape next. He unearthed a set of massive cast-iron counterweights from a defunct seed drill. They weighed nearly 200 pounds each. He found the heavy-duty logging chains he used for pulling fallen oaks, their links as thick as his thumb. The mechanism itself was born from pure, rustic ingenuity. It was a deadfall trap, writ large and forged in steel. He dug a shallow pit across the access road, just around a blind curve. In the pit, he laid 2 sections of railroad tie as a foundation. He fabricated a trigger, a pressure plate made from a sheet of diamond plate steel, connected to a complex lever system scavenged from a hay baler's knot assembly. The genius of it was in its simplicity. The weight of a vehicle driving over the plate would release a locking pin. The pin held back the lever, and the lever held the chain. The final piece was the fulcrum. He used the hydraulic lift arm from a junked front-end loader, sinking its base deep into the earth and anchoring it with concrete. He mixed himself, bag by bag, his muscles screaming in protest. From the end of this arm, suspended by the logging chain, hung the sharpened tine, its point aimed directly at the center of the trigger plate. The counterweights were positioned to give the arm a terrifying velocity when released. He worked through the night. The only light from a single bare bulb in his workshop and the cold, distant stars. Every clang of the hammer, every spark from the grinder, was a prayer to a god of iron and retribution. He wasn't building a trap, he was forging a consequence. He was answering the Hamiltons' casual, cruel dismissal of his life with a very real, very physical rebuttal. He was a man of the earth, and he was about to remind them that the earth had teeth. When it was done, he camouflaged his work with the meticulous care of a creditor. He covered the pressure plate with dirt and leaves, making it indistinguishable from the rest of the road. He draped the lift arm and chain with branches and vines, blending it seamlessly into the dense woods. To a casual observer, the road was empty, unchanged. But beneath the thin veneer of normalcy lay a coiled spring of mechanical fury. He didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel satisfaction. He felt a profound and terrible calm. He had introduced an absolute into a world of maybes and what-ifs. The Hamiltons might get caught. The tractor might be found. Justice might be served. But if that black SUV came down his road again, it would be stopped. That was no longer in question. He retreated to the farmhouse and sat in his father's armchair, the worn leather cool against his skin. He didn't watch the road. He didn't need to. He would hear it. He just sat, listening to the house settle around him, the ghosts of his family whispering in the quiet corners. He was a farmer. He had planted a seed of terrible justice, and now all he could do was wait for the harvest. The sun began to set, painting the western sky in hues of bruised purple and angry orange. The cicadas started their evening chorus, a sound that was usually a comfort but now felt like 1,000 tiny clocks, all ticking down. Then he heard it. It was faint at first. The arrogant growl of a high-performance engine, a sound that didn't belong in the tranquil twilight of his world. It grew louder, closer. It was the Hamiltons' Escalade. Jet's heart didn't race. It settled into a slow, heavy rhythm, like a drum beat before a battle. He closed his eyes. He pictured his father's face, the grease under his fingernails. He pictured Martha's smile as she brought him lemonade in the fields. He pictured Caleb, small and laughing on the big green tractor. The engine noise was loud now, right at the edge of the woods. It was a sound of violation, of trespass, of profound disrespect. Then came a new sound. It was not a crash. It was a percussive, violent puncture, a deep, resonant crunch of steel shearing steel, followed by the catastrophic shriek of a frame being twisted beyond its limits. A geyser-like hiss of steam and fluid erupting under immense pressure. The sounds were followed by a woman's scream, not one of anger, but of pure, animal terror, cut short by the jarring thump of the entire two-tone vehicle slamming down onto its ruined axle, and then, silence. A new kind of silence. Not the hollow silence of loss, but the heavy, final silence of consequence. Jedediah Stone pushed himself out of the armchair. His joints ached. His body was a geography of exhaustion, but his steps were steady as he walked. To the door, he didn't take a weapon. His weapon was already in the ground. He opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The evening air cool on his face, he walked, not ran, down the gravel drive and onto the dirt access road. The smell hit him first, a sharp, acrid mix of hot metal, antifreeze, and burnt oil. As he rounded the blind curve, the scene came into view. A tableau of rustic justice under the fading light. The black Escalade was stopped dead. It hadn't crashed. It had been caught, impaled. The sharpened subsoiler tine had punched straight through the vehicle's undercarriage, ripped through the engine block, and burst out the top of the hood like a monstrous steel fang. The front of the SUV was pinned violently to the earth, its front wheels splayed at a broken angle, the entire vehicle sagging as if it had been gutted. Steam hissed from the gaping wound in the hood, mingling with the twilight. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sounds were the rhythmic hiss of the ruptured radiator and the frantic, shallow breathing of Cynthia Hamilton. The world had been reduced to this one impossible image, the gleaming symbol of their city. Power broken and bleeding on a farmer's dirt road. Richard Hamilton found his voice first, but it wasn't the booming, confident baritone he used in courtrooms and boardrooms. It was a thin, reedy thing, strangled by disbelief. What in God's name have you done? Jedediah didn't answer immediately. He took another slow step forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. His eyes were fixed on the point of entry, the place where his father's subsoiler had met the Escalade's grill. He looked at it with the dispassionate interest of a mechanic examining a failed part. "This is my land," Jedediah said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. It carried in the still air with unnerving clarity. "You're trespassing, trespassing!" Cynthia shrieked, the sound tearing through her carefully maintained composure. "He's a maniac, Richard. He tried to kill us. Call the police. Call them now." Richard fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped it. He stabbed at the screen, his face a mask of furious terror. "You're finished? Stone, you hear me? You'll rot in a prison cell for this. Assault with a deadly weapon? Attempted murder." Jedediah watched him, his expression unchanging. "You think that's a weapon?" He gestured with his chin toward the tine. "That's a piece of a plow for turning the earth. Something you wouldn't know anything about." "There's no signal," Richard snarled, lowering the phone, and glaring at it as if it had personally betrayed him. He looked up, his eyes wild. "No signal. This is a dead zone. It's always been a dead zone, Jedediah said calmly. People who belong here know that. The implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating. They didn't belong here, and now the modern tool that connected them to their world of influence and power was useless. They were as isolated as if they'd crashed on another planet. I'll give you one chance, Stone Richard said, trying to regain some semblance of control, falling back on the only tactic he knew, intimidation. You let us out of this death trap right now, and I'll consider not pressing charges that will see you buried so deep your family will forget your name. Jedediah almost smiled. It was a sad, tired movement of his lips that never reached his eyes. You're not in a position to be making offers, Mr. Hamilton. You're in a hole, a deep one, and you're the one who dug it. He took another step closer, stopping just out of arm's reach of the driver's side door. He leaned down slightly, forcing Richard to look up at him. You want to talk about what's buried? Let's talk about my wife. I buried her with that tractor. The one you stole. The words hit them harder than the impact. Cynthia let out a soft, whimpering sound. Richard's face went from red with rage to a pasty, sickly white eye. I don't know what you're talking about, he stammered, but the lie was flimsy. Transparent, don't you? Jedediah's voice dropped lower, becoming a gravelly whisper that was more menacing than any shout. A 1978 John Deere, 4440 green. Faded paint on the hood. The left fender is welded where my boy, Caleb, rolled his bike into it when he was 6. He's buried out there, too. That tractor dug his grave. He paused, letting the weight of his history settle into the confined space of their luxury prison. You didn't just steal a machine. You stole the last thing I have of my family. You drove onto my land, and you took my son's hands, my wife's memory, my father's sweat. And you did it so you could have a better view from your heated infinity pool. Richard stared, speechless. The sheer, raw truth of words stripped away his defenses. This wasn't about property anymore. It was about something primal, something he couldn't litigate or buy his way out of. What do you want? Cynthia whispered, her voice trembling. She was looking at Jedediah now, not as a hick farmer, but as something elemental, something she couldn't comprehend. Money. We'll give you money. Whatever you want. Your money is worthless here, Jedediah said, his gaze shifting. To her, it can't fill a grave, it can't bring back a memory, and it can't pull your car off that tine. As if on cue, there was a deep, groaning sound from beneath them. The entire vehicle shifted, dropping another inch with a sickening lurch that sent a fresh wave of terror through the cabin. Cynthia screamed again, grabbing Richard's arm. The frame, stern, Richard yelled, his eyes wide with panic as he looked at the steel shaft protruding from his hood. It'll hold, Jedediah said, though he wasn't entirely sure it would. For now, the ground is soft here. He straightened up. You want to know what I want? It's simple. I want my tractor back. We don't have it, Richard insisted, his voice cracking. But you know who does, Jedediah stated. It wasn't a question. You're a lawyer, a man of details. You didn't just hire some random thief. You hired a professional. Someone you thought was clean, untraceable. Someone you have a number for. He held out his hand. Give me the phone. Richard hesitated, his mind racing, searching for an angle, a way out. He saw none. There was only the farmer, the growing darkness, and the steel tine that had pierced the heart of his world. With a shaking hand, he passed his phone to Jedediah. What's the number? Jedediah asked. Defeated, Richard recited the 10 digits. Jedediah dialed, his thumb moving with slow, deliberate precision. He put the phone on speaker, the electronic tones echoing in the quiet woods. It rang once, twice. A gruff voice answered. Yeah, it's Richard Hamilton, Richard said, his voice strained. What the hell do you want? The voice grumbled. I told you not to call this number again. The job's done. The thing's already on a container ship. Jedediah's eyes narrowed. A container ship. They were going to send his history overseas? Melt it down for scrap. The cold calm in his chest flickered, and for a moment, a hot white rage took its place. He fought it down. Not yet. There's been a change of plans, Richard said, his voice pleading. I need it back. I need you to bring it back now. There was a pause on the other end, then a rough laugh. You drunk Hamilton. You know what it took to get that thing? No, the deal is done. Your problem now. Listen to me, you son of a bitch, Richard hissed, his fear momentarily replaced by anger. You will turn that truck around and you will bring that tractor back, or I swear to God, or what? The man sneered. You'll call the cops. Go ahead. We'll both go down. You think I didn't keep a recording of our first call? The one where you laid out the whole plan? Checkmate. Richard's face fell. He was trapped from all sides. Jedediah spoke then, his voice cutting through the stalemate, cold and sharp as the tine in their engine. This isn't Mr. Hamilton you're talking to anymore. There was dead silence on the other end of the line. Who is this? The man finally asked, his tone shifting from arrogance to caution. I'm the man whose tractor you stole, Jedediah said, and I'm giving you one opportunity to make things right. You're going to turn your truck around. You're going to bring my property back to the place you took it from. You're going to unload it in the barn, put the key on the seat, and leave. You're not going to talk to anyone. You're not going to stop for gas. you're just going to drive. And if I don't? The man asked, a hint of defiance in his voice. Jedediah looked from the impaled SUV to the two pale faces inside. He looked at the logging chain, stretched taut, disappearing into the dark woods. He looked at the massive counterweights he knew were hanging in the balance. A second, even more terrible consequence he had prepared, in case the first wasn't enough. He leaned closer to the phone, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, meant as much for the Hamiltons as for the man on the line. If you don't, Jedediah said slowly, then Mr. Hamilton's accident becomes a crime scene, and the only evidence connecting you to it will be the anonymous tip I call in from a payphone in the next town over. A tip that will include your name, your license plate, and the exact location of your container ship. Mr. Hamilton is a very important man. The police will spare no expense. They will find you. He paused. But if you do as I say, then Mr. and Mrs. Hamilton just had a bit of car trouble. They'll be home safe by morning, and you'll be a ghost. He let the choice hang in the air, a choice between disappearing and being hunted for the rest of his life. The man on the other end was no fool. He was a professional. He knew when to cut his losses. Where's the turnoff? The man grunted after a long, tense silence. Jedediah gave him the directions. How long? 4 hours. Maybe 5. You have 3, Jedediah said, and then he did something that made Cynthia Hamilton's blood run cold. He took the phone off speaker, put it to his own ear, and took a few steps away from the car, turning his back to them. His voice was too low for them to hear his words, but they could hear the cadence of his speech. He was giving more instructions. Quiet, calm, and methodical. Richard and Cynthia stared at his back, at the silhouette of the farmer against the last dying light. What else could he be saying? The deal was made. The tractor was coming back, but he was still talking. After a moment, Jedediah ended the call. He walked back to the car, his face unreadable. He didn't return the phone. He slipped it into his own pocket. What did you say to him? Richard demanded, his voice thin with a new kind of dread. What else did you tell him? Jedediah looked down at them, trapped in the wreckage of their own. The darkness in the woods was not like the darkness in the city. It wasn't a mere absence of light, diluted by the glow of a million distant windows and street lamps. It was a physical presence. It pressed in on the Escalade's windows, thick and suffocating, alive with the rustle of unseen things and the ancient, patient breathing of the trees. For Richard and Cynthia Hamilton, it was like being sealed in a tomb. An hour passed, or maybe it was a lifetime. Time had lost its familiar cadence. Every minute was a long, drawn-out torment filled with the phantom sounds of their own fear. A snapping twig was the farmer returning with an axe. The hoot of an owl was a signal. The wind whispering through the pines sounded like a final judgment. This is your fault, Cynthia said, her voice a venomous hiss in the confines of the car. The initial shock had worn off, curdling into a bitter, desperate rage. I told you to just pay the man. Pay him whatever he wanted for this stupid, worthless dirt. But no, you had to be clever, you had to handle it. Be quiet, Cynthia, Richard snapped, his own voice frayed. He was staring at the steel tine that rose from the hood of his car like a grave marker. He could feel the engine block, cold and dead, beneath his feet. I was trying to save us money. You're the one who wanted the unspoiled view. You're the one who couldn't stand looking at that disgusting old barn. So you steal his tractor, a family heirloom. What kind of brilliant legal mind thinks that's a solution? She shot back, her voice rising with hysteria. Did you really think he'd just, what? Pack up and leave? We're sitting in a 10,000-pound paperweight because of your arrogance. My arrogance, Richard laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Who was it that drove the hounds through his fence line? Who was it that called his farm a blight at the country club? You poked the bear, Cynthia. You poked him with a stick until he finally bit back. Their argument was a frantic, pathetic attempt to push the blame, the terror, onto each other. It was easier than confronting the monumental truth, that they were completely, utterly powerless. Their money meant nothing. Their influence meant nothing. Out here, in the dark, they were just two people trapped in a metal box, waiting for the man who put them there to decide their fate. Another sound cut through their bickering. The crunch of boots on gravel, slow and steady. They both froze, their faces turning towards the windshield. A beam of light bobbed through the darkness, growing closer. It was Jedediah. He wasn't carrying an axe. He was carrying a plaid wool blanket and a large stainless steel thermos. He approached the passenger side window, and Cynthia flinched away from the glass as if he were a ghost. Jedediah didn't seem to notice. He simply laid the folded blanket on the hood of the car, next to the gaping wound. He then unscrewed the cap of the thermos, which doubled as a cup, and poured a stream of steaming dark liquid into it. The rich, bitter smell of strong coffee filled the air. He placed the cup beside the blanket. It's a cold night, he said, his voice as calm and steady as it had been hours before. You should have something warm. The sheer baffling civility of the act was more terrifying than any threat. He wasn't treating them like hostages. He was treating them like neighbors who'd had car trouble. A bizarre act of rural hospitality that completely ignored the violent reality of their situation. We don't want your coffee, Richard snarled, trying to find his footing to re-establish the old hierarchy. We want the police. We want a tow truck. We want off your goddamn property. Jedediah looked at him, his eyes reflecting the beam of his flashlight. The police can't help you, Mr. Hamilton. A tow truck can't get back here. And you're not leaving until my property is returned. He gestured with his head towards the blanket and coffee. Take it or leave it. Makes no difference to me. He started to turn away. Wait. Cynthia's voice was sharp. He stopped, turning back to her. What other instructions did you give him? The man on the phone? What did you tell him after you took the phone off speaker? The question hung in the air. It was the question that had been tormenting them for the past hour. The hook on which all their worst fears were hung. Jedediah stared at her for a long moment. He didn't answer. Instead, he said, my wife, Martha, she made the best coffee. Used to bring it out to me in a thermos, just like this one when I was plowing late. She always said a man's soul gets cold before his hands do. The nonsense was a masterpiece of psychological cruelty. He wasn't just ignoring her question. He was replacing it with another piece of his history, another reminder of what they had tried to erase. He was telling them, in his own way, that his world operated on rules they couldn't begin to comprehend. He turned and walked away, his flashlight beam disappearing back towards the distant, warm light of the farmhouse, leaving them alone again, with the blanket, the coffee, and their spiraling terror. They didn't touch either. The offering felt like a trap, a poison dot. Another hour crawled by. The silence returned, heavier this time, pressing in on them. Then, a new sound, the low rumble of a heavy diesel engine, coming from the direction of the main road. He's back, Richard whispered, a surge of adrenaline cutting through his fear. The thief. He's back. A pair of bright, high headlights cut through the trees sweeping across the woods as the vehicle turned off the county road. The Hamiltons stared, their hearts pounding. This was it. The tractor would be returned. Their ordeal would be over. But as the truck got closer, they saw something else. Another set of lights was following it. A smaller vehicle. Its headlights, lower to the ground. 2 trucks. Who's that? Cynthia breathed, her hand gripping Richard's arm. Did he bring someone with him? Hope, desperate and fierce, flared in Richard's chest. Maybe it's the police. Maybe the driver called them. The first truck, a large flatbed, rumbled to a stop 50 yards from them, its headlights illuminating the entire scene in a harsh, theatrical glare. And there, on the back of the flatbed, was the John Deere. It looked less like a piece of farm equipment and more like a captured king being returned to his throne. Its green paint seemed to glow, proud and defiant. A man jumped down from the cab, his face obscured by shadow. He moved with a swift, no-nonsense efficiency, unchaining the tractor and lowering the ramp. He climbed onto the machine, and the old diesel engine turned over with a familiar, throaty roar that was music to Jedediah's ears, who had emerged from the farmhouse and was standing like a sentinel by his barn. The thief drove the John Deere off the flatbed, parked it right in the entrance to the barn, and hopped off, leaving the key on the seat. He didn't even glance at the Impaled Escalade. He got back in his truck, and without a moment's hesitation, rumbled away, his taillights disappearing into the night. Now the second vehicle pulled forward. It wasn't another truck. It was a county sheriff's cruiser. The blue and red lights were off, but there was no mistaking the emblem on the door. It's the sheriff, Cynthia cried, a sob of pure relief catching in her throat. Richard, we're saved. Help, sheriff, help us. Richard started laying on the horn, the sound pathetic and muffled by the damaged electrics. He yelled, his voice hoarse. Down here. We're down here. Arrest that man. He's a maniac. He tried to murder us. Sheriff Brody got out of his car. He was a big man, and he moved with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who had seen too much to ever be in a hurry. He didn't look at the screaming trapped couple in the SUV. His eyes were on Jedediah. He walked over to the barn, his gaze taking in the whole impossible scene. The tractor sitting pristine and safe, the Escalade broken and pinned to the earth, and Jedediah standing perfectly still, his face calm. Evening, Jed, Brody said, his voice a low rumble. Sheriff? Jedediah nodded. Got an anonymous tip, Brody said, still not looking. At the Hamiltons, something about a possible hostage situation out on your property. Said some city folks' car broke down and they were getting hysterical. Richard's yelling faltered. He stared, confused. That wasn't the story. That wasn't what happened. Brody walked over and kicked one of the Escalade's flat tires. He peered at the massive steel tine as if it were a strange species of mushroom that had sprouted from the ground. Damn, looks like you hit something fierce, Mr. Hamilton. This old access road is full of surprises. Guess you tore your engine block clean open. What are you talking about? Cynthia screamed, her face pressed against the glass. He did this? Batman. He set a trap. Arrest him. Sheriff Brody finally turned his head and looked at her, his expression one of mild annoyance, as if she were a yapping dog. He then looked back at Jed. He gestured toward the tractor. Glad to see you got your 4,440 back, Jed. I was just about to issue an APB on it. Must have been a misunderstanding. He paused, then asked, you get that fence mended on the back pasture? The question, so mundane, so normal, was the final, devastating blow. Richard and Cynthia stared in stunned silence. The sheriff wasn't going to help them. He wasn't going to arrest Jedediah. He was taking the farmer's side. The law, their ultimate shield, the tool they had wielded their entire lives, was ignoring them. They had driven into a world with a different set of rules, and they had just been informed, in no uncertain terms, that they were not the ones who made them. Well, Brody said, turning to walk back to his cruiser. Looks like you folks are going to be here a while. I'll let your insurance company know where to find you in the morning. The taillights of Sheriff Brody's cruiser vanished, and a silence more profound than any before descended upon the clearing. It was the silence of abandonment. The law, which the Hamiltons had always viewed as a tool, a service they could summon and direct, had turned its back on them. It had looked at their predicament, weighed it against a farmer's grievance, and found them wanting. In the cold, dead Escalade, this realization landed with the force of a physical blow. They were no longer victims of a bizarre accident. They were no longer hostages in a negotiation. They were simply left, discarded. The rules of their world had been suspended, and the architect of this new reality was the silent man standing by the barn, a silhouette against the warm light of his home. Cynthia began to weep, not the loud hysterical sobs of before, but a quiet, hopeless sound of utter defeat. Richard stared straight ahead, his mind, usually a whirlwind of legal strategy and calculated leverage, now a complete and terrifying blank. He had no moves left. He had spent his life in a game where he owned the board, and now he found himself in a contest where he didn't even understand the pieces. An hour passed. The cold began to seep through the sealed doors of the SUV, a creeping, invasive chill that their expensive clothing was not designed to repel. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind a deep, trembling exhaustion and a gnawing dread. Then, the crunch of boots on gravel. Again Jedediah emerged from the darkness. This time, he carried no offerings. His hands were empty. He stopped by the driver's side window, and Richard, despite himself, flinched. The farmer's face, illuminated by the cold moonlight, was different now. The quiet grief was gone. The patient anger was gone. In its place was a look of hard, unyielding purpose. It was the face of a man who had made a decision. My tractor is back, Jedediah said, his voice level. That part of our business is concluded. A flicker of hope, fragile and desperate, ignited in Richard's chest. So, it's over. You'll let us go. Jedediah looked at him as if he were a child who had fundamentally misunderstood the lesson. Oh, for Mr. Hamilton, you seem to think this was only about the tractor. The tractor was just the bill coming due. The debt has been accumulating for over a year. He walked around the front of the vehicle, his boots scuffing against the dirt, and stopped at the edge of the woods. He pointed into the darkness. That fence line, the one your hounds have torn through 4 times. It separates my north pasture from the old logging trail. There's a storm front moving in, supposed to hit before dawn. Wind and rain. My cattle get spooked in a storm. If that fence isn't sound, they'll break through, get onto the county road, and someone could get killed. A family coming home late, maybe a kid driving his first car. He let the image hang in the air, connecting their casual negligence to a potential, catastrophic consequence. I'm one man, he continued, his voice relentless, and I've spent the last 2 days building this. He gestured vaguely at the trap, and getting my property back. I don't have the time to fix it myself before the storm hits. He turned and walked back towards the barn, disappearing into the shadows for a moment. When he returned, he was carrying tools. They were old, heavy, their wooden handles worn smooth by years of use. He dropped them on the ground beside the Escalade with a heavy thud. There was a post-hole digger, its twin handles like monstrous iron scissors, a pair of wire stretchers, a heavy-duty hammer, a canvas bag filled with fence staples, a roll of barbed wire, its sharp points glinting like teeth in the moonlight. What is this? Cynthia asked, her voice barely a whisper. This is your way out, Jedediah said, looking directly at Richard. There are 3 broken posts and about 50 yards of wire that need to be restrung. You're going to dig new holes. You're going to set new posts. You're going to stretch that wire so tight it hums, and you're going to do it before the sun comes up. The sheer audacity of the demand was stunning. Richard stared at the tools, then at Jedediah's implacable face. He burst out laughing, a wild, incredulous sound. You're insane, he sputtered. Absolutely, certifiably insane. You think that we are going to perform manual labor? You're delusional. I'm a lawyer. I don't dig holes. Tonight, you do, Jedediah said, his voice unwavering. When the job is done, and I'm satisfied that my herd is secure, I'll release the car. Until then, you can sit here and freeze. The choice is yours. This is slavery. It's forced labor. I'll sue you into the Stone Age, Richard roared, his voice cracking with impotent fury. Jedediah didn't even blink. You can't sue me if you freeze to death first. And Sheriff Brody seems to think you're just having some bad luck with your car. Who do you think a judge is going to believe? The respected local farmer trying to prevent a tragedy, or the city lawyer with a history of harassing his neighbors, found trespassing on private land? He had thought it all through. He had turned their own world of liability and plausible deniability against them. He turned to leave. There are spare posts by the fence line. You'll find them. He walked away without another word, the darkness swallowing him whole, leaving them with the tools, the ultimatum, and the rapidly dropping temperature. For a long time, they just sat there, encased in their disbelief. But the cold was a powerful motivator. It was a real, physical thing that crept into their bones, making their teeth chatter. The luxurious leather seats of the Escalade felt like slabs of ice. "We have to do it, Richard?" Cynthia said, her voice chattering. "He's not bluffing. He'll leave us here." "Don't be ridiculous, Cynthia," he snapped. "It's a trick, a power play. We don't move, we wait him out." "Wait for what?" "Hypothermia. He has food, and warmth, and a bed. We have nothing. Look at me, Richard," she pleaded, her face pale and drawn in the gloom. "I can't feel my feet. We have to do something." The argument raged for another 20 minutes, a battle between Richard's shattered pride and Cynthia's primal fear. In the end, the cold one dot with a curse that tore from the very depths of his soul. Richard pushed open the heavy driver's side door. The hinges groaned in protest. Stepping out onto the cold, hard ground was like stepping into another dimension. He was no longer Richard Hamilton, Esquire. Lee was just a man in a $1,000 suit, standing in the dirt, about to dig a hole. Cynthia followed, stumbling in her fashionable but entirely impractical boots. The work was a nightmare. The post-hole digger was a medieval torture device. Richard, who considered a tough round of golf a workout, struggled to even lift it. He'd plunge it into the earth, and it would bite into a rock or a root, jarring. His arms to the shoulder, his hands, accustomed to the smooth finish of a Mont Blanc pen, were raw and blistering within minutes. Cynthia tried to help, pulling at the handles with him, her breath coming in ragged gasps. They were clumsy, inefficient, a pathetic parody of laborers. They argued, they swore, they blamed each other, but they kept working. The fear of freezing was a relentless whip at their backs. Slowly, painfully, a hole was dug. They dragged a heavy cedar post from the fence line and managed to wrestle it into place. Then came the wire. It was a vicious, animate thing, snagging on their clothes, tearing their skin. The wire stretchers were a puzzle they couldn't solve, a complex piece of rustic machinery that seemed to defy all logic. Hours passed. The moon tracked across the sky. Their fancy clothes were shredded and stained with mud and blood. Their bodies screamed with the protest of unused muscles. But somewhere in the midst of the misery, a change occurred. The bickering stopped, replaced by short, clipped commands. Pull, hold it steady, hammer. They were forced to rely on each other to coordinate their movements, to function as a team. The physical effort stripped them down too, their essential selves. There was no room for sarcasm or social maneuvering. When all your energy was focused on driving a staple into a wooden post without hitting your own thumb. For the first time, Richard saw the land not as a landscape, a view to be purchased, but as an adversary, a stubborn, unyielding thing of rock and root and clay that demanded sweat and blood for every inch you took from it. He looked at the long dark line of the fence stretching into the distance, and for a fleeting moment, he felt a grudging respect for the man who maintained it all, day after day. Just as the eastern sky began to bleed with the first pale light of dawn, they hammered in the final staple. They stood back, gasping for air, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. The fence was a ragged, ugly thing. The posts were slightly crooked, the wire sagged in places, but it was whole. It was a barrier. They were covered in mud and filth. Cynthia's perfect manicure was a distant memory, her nails broken and caked with dirt. Richard's suit was ruined beyond repair, his hands a bloody mess of blisters and cuts. They looked at each other, and for the first time, they didn't see a rival or a disappointment. They just saw someone else who had survived the same ordeal. If summoned by the completion of their task, Jedediah appeared. He walked out of the gloom, carrying a steaming mug of what they knew was coffee. He didn't look at them. He walked the length of their repair, his eyes critical, his hands testing the tension of the wire, kicking at the base of the new posts. He walked the 50 yards, then turned and walked back. He stopped in front of them, taking a slow sip from his mug. He looked from their filthy, exhausted faces to their handiwork. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "It'll hold." The dawn broke, gray and unforgiving, the light doing nothing to warm the chilling scene. It only served to illuminate the full extent of the Hamiltons' new prison. The Escalade, once a symbol of their mobility and status, was now a monument to their folly, pinned to the earth at both ends like a specimen in a collector's case. The hope that had carried them through the fence repair, the belief that this was a transaction with a clear end, had been brutally executed. Richard stared at the second spike, the one that had obliterated the rear of his vehicle, and something inside him finally snapped. It wasn't a loud, furious break, but a quiet, internal collapse. The intricate framework of his world, built on leverage, loopholes, and the assumption of his own superiority, had been dismantled and used for parts. He sank to his knees in the mud, the fight completely gone from him, his ruined suit jacket hanging off his slumped shoulders. He was no longer Richard Hamilton, Esquire. He was just a man on his knees in the dirt. Cynthia looked at him, and for the first time, she felt no anger, no desire to blame him. She saw only a reflection of her own despair. The man she had married, a titan in his own world, was broken. And if he was broken, what hope did she have? A dry, racking sob escaped her lips. A sound of pure, hopeless grief. Jedediah watched them, his face impassive. He let their despair settle, let the full weight of their indefinite sentence crush them. He was not a sadist, he was a farmer. He knew that before you can plant a new seed, the ground must be thoroughly broken. The sun is up, he said, his voice cutting through their misery. The day is wasted standing still. He turned and walked towards a section of his property they had often sneered at from their hilltop home. It was a 2-acre plot of land, sloping gently towards the creek that looked as if the earth had tried to vomit up its own skeleton. The field was choked with rocks, from fist-sized stones to boulders the size of small sheep, all tangled in a mess of weeds and thorny brush. It was an ugly, unproductive piece of land. He stopped at its edge and waited. After a long moment, Cynthia, moving like an old woman, nudged Richard's shoulder. "Get up, Richard. We have to get up." He didn't respond. He just knelt in the mud, staring at nothing. "Get up," she screamed, her voice cracking with a new, desperate urgency. She pulled at his arm, her small strength barely enough to move him. "He will leave us here to die. Get up." Slowly, mechanically, Richard rose to his feet. They stumbled after Jedediah, their bodies a symphony of aches and pains, their minds numb with shock. Jedediah pointed to the field of stones. "My grandfather tried to clear this field. My father tried to clear this field. They broke 2 plows on it, and finally, gave up, planted hay around it. They said the earth was too mean here." He looked at the Hamiltons, his eyes cold and clear. "You called this my rock garden. You said it was an eyesore that was dragging down the value of your property." He gestured to a pile of tools he had placed there earlier. There were no machines, just 2 heavy steel pry bars, and a rickety wooden wheelbarrow with an iron wheel. "You're going to clear it," he said. Richard stared at the field, at the impossible sea of rocks. "It would take an army a month to clear this." "No," he whispered, the word barely audible. "I can't." "You can," Jedediah stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You start with the small ones, the ones you can carry. You put them in the barrow. When it's full, you wheel it to the edge of the woods, and you make a pile. Then you come back and you fill it again. For the bigger ones, you use the bars. You find the leverage. You work them out of the earth. For the ones that are too big to move, you use the hammers. You make little rocks out of big rocks." He looked from Richard's bloody, manicured hands to Cynthia's ruined boots. "This isn't about punishment. This is about value. You think value is a view, a number on a piece of paper? Out here, value is this." He stamped his foot on the hard ground. "It's what you can make the earth give you. This field has no value. It's an eyesore. You're right. So you're going to give it value. You're going to make it clean." He turned to leave, then stopped. "There's a bucket of water and a loaf of bread by the tree. Make it last the day. If you're not working, you're not eating." And then he was gone, retreating to another part of the farm, leaving them alone with the field of stones. The first few hours were a descent into hell. The work was brutal, mindless, and soul-crushing. Every rock they lifted seemed to reveal 2 more beneath it. The wheelbarrow, with its single iron wheel, was a nightmare to push across the uneven ground, constantly threatening to tip over. Richard's hands, already blistered from fixing the fence, were now raw meat. He swung the sledgehammer with a clumsy rage, missing the rock entirely half the time, the impact vibrating up the handle and jarring his teeth. Cynthia, frail and exhausted, did what she could. She gathered the smaller stones, her back screaming in protest, her arms aching from the repetitive strain. They didn't speak. The sheer scale of the task was beyond words. It was a physical manifestation of their hopelessness. Around noon, Richard collapsed. He simply dropped the pry bar, stumbled to the shade of the tree, and curled into a ball, his body shaking. "I'm done," he gasped, his face pale with exhaustion. "I can't. Let him kill me. I don't care anymore." Cynthia watched him. The Cynthia of 2 days ago would have screamed at him, called him weak, pathetic. But she was that Cynthia no more. She looked at his bleeding hands, at the dirt and sweat streaking his face, and she felt a pang of something she hadn't felt in years. Pity. She walked over, picked up the tin bucket of water, and brought it to him. She dipped a piece of her own ruined blouse into the water and began to gently clean the cuts on his hands. He flinched, but didn't pull away. "We have to keep going, Richard," she said softly, her voice hoarse. "If we stop, we lose." "We've already lost," he mumbled into the dirt. "It's over." "No," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of iron. "It's only over when we say it is. He thinks he can break us. He thinks we're just soft city people who will give up. I am not going to give him the satisfaction." She wasn't sure where the words came from. They were a surprise even to her. But as she said them, she felt a flicker of something she thought was long dead. Her own pride, not the brittle, arrogant pride of her social standing, but a deeper, more stubborn thing. The refusal to be broken. She stood up, picked up a rock, and threw it into the wheelbarrow with a grunt. Then another, and another. Richard watched her for a long time. He watched his wife, the woman he'd seen command charity boards and tear down social rivals with a single cutting remark, now engaged in the most primitive form of labor, her body trembling with the effort, but refusing to stop. Slowly, painfully, He got to his feet, he picked up his sledgehammer, he walked to the nearest boulder, and he began to swing. They worked through the afternoon, a silent, grim team. They fell into a rhythm born of shared misery. He would break the larger rocks, and she would haul the pieces. They didn't talk, they just worked. The sun beat down on them, their muscles burned, their minds went blessedly blank, focused only on the next rock, the next swing, the next load. They were no longer the Hamiltons. They were just a man and a woman moving stones. As dusk approached, the sky began to change. The clear blue was replaced by a bruised, purple-gray mass of clouds rolling in from the west. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain. It was the storm Jedediah had predicted. The first drops were fat and cold, splattering in the dust. Around them, within minutes, it was a downpour, a cold, driving rain that soaked them to the skin in seconds. It was their chance to stop. They had every excuse. No one could work in this. But they didn't stop. Richard, his hair plastered to his skull, his ruined suit clinging to him like a second skin, kept swinging the sledgehammer. The rain washed the blood from his hands as he worked. Cynthia, shivering uncontrollably, kept loading the wheelbarrow, her movements slow but deliberate. To stop would be to surrender. To seek shelter in the shadow of their impaled car would be to admit defeat. And so they worked on, a desperate, defiant act against the storm, against the land, against the man who was watching them. From the porch of his farmhouse, Jedediah Stone watched the two figures in the field. He watched them, through his father's old binoculars, as the storm raged around them. He had expected them to run, to quit, to huddle by their car like frightened children, but they kept working. He saw the man, swinging the hammer with a steady, if clumsy, rhythm. He saw the woman, leaning all of her slight weight into the wheelbarrow, forcing it through the mud. They were miserable, they were pathetic, but they were not broken. He lowered the binoculars, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. He had set an impossible task to teach them about despair. He had not expected them to respond with defiance. He had wanted to show them the meaning of hard land, and they, in their own clumsy, stubborn way, were learning the lesson. He stood there for a long time, watching them as the rain lashed down. Then, he turned and went into his barn. He returned not with blankets or coffee, but with two old oilskin rain slickers. They were heavy and smelled of dust and time. They were his father's. He walked out into the storm, his boots sinking into the mud. He didn't go all the way to the field. He stopped at the edge, by the tree where their water and bread had been. He laid the two raincoats. It was Cynthia who saw them first. Through the driving sheets of rain, she saw two dark shapes hanging from the branch of the oak tree. They hadn't been there before. For a moment, her exhausted mind failed to process the image, seeing them as some new, ominous part of the trap. Then she recognized the shape. Rain slickers. She stopped, the rock she was carrying slipping from her numb fingers and splashing into the mud. Richard, she breathed, her voice lost in the wind. He didn't hear her. He was locked in his own world of misery, swinging the sledgehammer with a rhythm that was more convulsion than controlled effort. She stumbled over to him, grabbing his arm. He turned on her with a wild look in his eyes, ready to snarl, but her expression stopped him. She was pointing, her trembling finger aimed at the tree. He followed her gaze. He saw the coats, hanging heavy and dark against the gray storm. It was an impossible gesture, an act of mercy from a man who had shown them none. It was a gesture that said, I see you are still here, and I will not let you die in my storm. It was, in its own way, more devastating than the sledgehammer. The relentless cruelty had been something they could fight against, a force to harden themselves against. This small, practical kindness shattered their defenses. It was an acknowledgement that they were human, and in that moment of shared humanity, the full weight of what they had done, and what had been done to them, came crashing down. Richard looked from the coats to his wife, her face streaked with mud and rain, her body shivering violently. He looked at their pathetic patch of cleared land, a testament to their suffering. He looked back at the coats. He didn't say a word. He dropped the hammer, walked to the tree, and took the slickers from the branch. They were heavy, stiff with age, and smelled of earth and oil, and a life they had never known. He helped Cynthia into one, his clumsy bloody fingers struggling with the clasps. She did the same for him. Wrapped in the heavy waterproof canvas, a small pocket of warmth began to form around them. It wasn't comfort, it was survival, and it had been given to them by their tormentor. They went back to work. The storm raged for another hour, and they moved through it, encased in the farmer's offering. The rain eventually lessened, turning to a steady, cold drizzle that lasted through the night. They worked until their bodies gave out, then huddled together under the oak tree, too exhausted to even feel the gnawing hunger in their stomachs. They slept, for the first time, a deep, dreamless sleep on the cold, wet ground. They woke to the sound of a rooster crowing. The sun was rising, a clean, sharp light that made the wet world glitter. The storm had passed. They sat up, their bodies screaming in protest, every muscle a knot of pain. They looked at the field. In the clear morning light, their work seemed pitifully small, a tiny island of cleared earth in an ocean of rock, but it was real. They had made a mark. They saw Jedediah walking towards them from the farmhouse. He wasn't carrying tools or food. His hands were empty. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over them, taking in their filthy, exhausted state, before settling on the small patch of cleared land. He looked at it for a long time. Richard got to his feet, a slow, painful process. He stood before the farmer, not with defiance, not with anger, but with the profound emptiness of a man who has nothing left to lose. "I understand," Richard said, his voice a raw rasp. Jedediah just looked at him, waiting. "It wasn't just the view," Richard continued, the confession spilling out of him, unbidden and necessary. "It was you, your farm. It was a reminder. Every day, we'd sit on our deck, in our perfect house, and we'd look down and see this." He gestured to the old barn, the fields, the whole working farm, and it felt real, more real than our lives. And I hated it. I hated you for it because you had this history, this meaning, and all I had was money. I thought if I could just erase you, erase this place, then my world would feel solid again. I thought my money made me better than you, stronger." He looked down at his own ruined hands, then back at Jedediah. "I was wrong. This is strength, what you do here, what your father did. It's real, and I tried to steal it because I was too weak to build it myself." He had finally spoken the truth. The ugly, pathetic, essential truth. Cynthia watched him, tears streaming down her face, not of sorrow, but of a strange, painful pride. He was no longer hiding. Jedediah listened, his expression unreadable. The confession seemed to land on him not with triumph, but with a deep, weary sadness. He had wanted justice, and he had gotten it. But the victory felt as heavy as the stones. In the field he nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, his voice quiet. "That's the truth." He turned without another word and walked towards the woods. He went first to the mechanism controlling the rear spike. There was a loud clang of a lever, the screech of metal on metal, and the heavy railroad plate was lifted from the Escalade's roof, swinging back into the trees. He then went to the front of the vehicle. He threw another lever, with a deep, groaning sound. The subsoiler tine was slowly, agonizingly extracted from the engine block. It pulled free with a final, sickening crunch, and the Escalade, free at last, slammed down onto its flattened front tires. The car was a wreck, a mangled, violated piece of machinery, but it was free. Richard and Cynthia stared, not daring to believe. It was over. Jedediah walked back and stood before them. "Go," he said. "The road is clear." Richard stumbled towards the car, his mind reeling. He pulled open the driver's door. Freedom. It was real. He could leave. He could go back. Cynthia followed, her steps unsteady. "Wait," Jedediah said. They froze, their hands on the car doors, a new wave of fear washing over them. Jedediah held out a piece of paper. It was old, folded, and slightly damp. "For you," he said, holding it out to Richard. Richard's hand trembled as he took it. He thought it was a bill, a list of damages that would surely bankrupt him. He unfolded it. It wasn't a bill. It was a deed, a quitclaim deed, properly filled out and notarized, the ink still fresh. His eyes scanned the legal description of the property. It was the 2-care field of stones. At the bottom, in the space for the new owner, Jedediah had printed their names, Richard and Cynthia Hamilton, and below that, he had signed his own. Richard looked up, his face a mask of utter confusion. "What is this?" "You cleared it," Jedediah said, his voice flat. "You worked it. You bled on it. According to the laws of this land, the ones that matter, you've earned it. It's yours now." The implications settled on them, more binding than any chain, more permanent than any steel spike. They could leave, but they could never truly escape. They now owned the very ground that had served as their prison, their crucible, their place of rebirth. "I don't want it," Richard whispered, trying to hand it back. Jedediah didn't take it. "It doesn't matter what you want," he said, his eyes holding Richard's. "It's your responsibility now. You can sell it, you can let it go back to weeds, or you can come back and finish the job. You can make it worth something. That's your choice." He turned and walked away, back towards his farmhouse, leaving them standing by their ruined car, the deed clutched in Richard's hand. They were free, but their freedom was a burden. They could drive away, back to their worlds of money and influence, but they would forever be tied to this small, stubborn patch of earth. They had come to take a man's land, and in the end, he had given them a piece of it, a permanent, unerasable reminder of the price of disrespect, and the terrible, transformative weight of earning something real. Their ordeal was over, but their reckoning had just begun.